Hey folks, it's Fernando doing another video for the Modern Survivalist. It's like the 10th time I try to do this video, trying to find the exact words, trying to understand exactly how much I should say and how much I should keep to myself. Not only because it's in my best interest, but because there's really no purpose in explaining certain things which you have to understand on your own. This is a pretty important video, given that it's affecting your life as of right now. What I'm going to be talking in this video is affecting your life right this moment in ways you probably don't quite understand. It's going to be affecting your life in the future and your children's life as well. Maybe more important than what I'm going to be saying in this video is what I'm not going to be saying, and what I hope for that what hopefully you will figure out on your own, which is very easy. You just have to do a little bit of Googling a few things, a few names and such, trying to connect the dots, trying to figure out who's in charge of what and such, and how different players interconnect with one another. Once you do that, you will be seeing what I'm not saying. I'm not saying it because it's the kind of thing you have to see it on your own. It's like the vast and the lady. You know, even if someone tries to explain it to you, sometimes there's really no use. It's something you have to figure out on your own. Why so mysterious and such? Well, this starts all with a comment that I got from Steve2323ZX. Do you agree with Cristina Fernandez calling debt extortion? Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, president of Argentina. Yes, I do agree with her. Kind of creepy that I agree with Cristina Kirchner in anything, but in this case I do agree with debt being extortion, especially in this particular case. We usually think of debt in the following way. We think of debt as in, I need $100 for starting a business or doing whatever. I go around looking for someone willing to loan me that amount of money that I need. Finally find someone willing to give me $100 with the condition that I pay back the money plus interest, right? I get my $100, start making monthly payments of $12-15 a month until I pay him back plus interest. That's the idea most of us have of debt, right? It's legal. It's pretty much the legal way in which it's supposed to work. It's the moral, even more important than legal, because legally speaking these days many things are very much unjust, but you know, that's the way it is. Now it's the right thing to do to pay back someone that loaned you the money plus the interest, because he took a risk by loaning that money to you. Now that's pretty different from this following scenario. If the people out there making the loans are in power and can ensure certain conditions so that I find myself in a position that I don't have any other option but to ask them for that money, right? If they make sure that I have no job, or that I'm being paid very little, that prices are beyond my reach, that inflation is awful, that I don't have any other choices, they eliminate any competition in the financial world. If they make sure all those conditions are set, and I don't have any other choice, I finally end up, you know, drowning, and I have no other choice but to ask them for that money. You know, I go to them and I say, you know what, I need those $100 to stay alive. You know, I don't have much of a choice. And they go, you know what, yeah, sure, I'm going to be giving you $100, but it's going to be at 1,000% interest. You're going to be paying me 1,000 or 10,000 bucks back. That's pretty different from the first scenario. That's immoral. That's not correct. Even though it may be legal in some terms, it's more of a loan shark type of territory, or worse. Now, even worse than that is that if I find myself in debt and someone sold that debt that I have to someone else, and that other group that bought my debt, maybe without even me knowing, they start increasing the levies, fines, and interest rates without even me having any control of that, and they finally come up with, okay, you now owe us 10 million bucks for the $100 that you owe us, that you owed in the first place. You go, what? You know, $100 now turned into $10 million that I now owe you? Well, yeah, that's the case. And they go to court and they finally end up with a ruling in their favor that I end up owing $10 million to someone that bought my debt. That's even worse than the two scenarios described before. That's kind of what's happening in Argentina, and that's kind of what's happening around the world to people that end up having to pay huge debts many times without them even knowing. You are suffering this kind of mechanism right now, this kind of immoral, wrong in any possible way, in which a group of people with power end up setting conditions in which they find themselves making profit beyond your wildest dreams at the cost of the suffering of a lot, and I mean a lot, like in most of the planet. That's what's going on. In the specific case of Argentina, and here is where you will start, this is as much as I'm going to be talking about this topic. I'm going to be talking specifically about Argentina. What's happening in Argentina with the debt situation that they have, all right? After this, we can talk about a little bit else and maybe come up to some other conclusions. Basically, the situation in Argentina is as follows. Argentina refuses to submit to debt extortion. This is USA Today News. It says, after the U.S. Supreme Court delivered a double-barrel defeat to Argentina Monday in the nation's continuing efforts to escape its creditors, President Cristina Kirchner said her country cannot comply with the demands to pay up. Fernandez, in a nationally televised address, said Argentina is willing to negotiate but will be unable to pay its debt within the next 2 weeks, as the court has ordered. What I cannot do as president is submit to the country to such extortion, Fernandez said. The High Court refused to consider Argentina's appeal of lower court rulings in New York that it remains liable for debts to holdouts creditors who earlier refused to accept its restructured debt offerings. Argentina basically is offering to pay the debt in a restructured way. The creditors simply do not accept that. Now, here where it says that Argentina is escaping where is that part? Escape its creditors. That's only partially true. Truth is that Argentina did arrange with most of their creditors, and they struck an agreement where Argentina is paying back plus interest and actually making, I think it's like 20% profit per year, something like that. Really not that bad. But a small percentage of the creditors, which are what they are usually called the vulture funds, did not go for that, did not accept this offering, and are demanding more and more. And that's why they end up going with the Supreme Court, because they just keep not accepting what the country is offering in terms of payment and the conditions. The justice ruled in a separate case that the holdout creditors have the right to seek the debtor's nation-hidden assets around the world. Only Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg dissented from that ruling. The ruling represents a victory for NML Capital, a so-called Vulture fund subsidiary of Paul Singer's Elliott Management Corporation. The hedge fund, which represents corporate investors, is owed more than $1.5 billion after refusing Argentina's 25 cents on the dollar offering in 2005 and 2010. Right. Keep those things in mind. NML Capital, we're going to be talking about that in a second. Elliott Management Fund, hedge funds and such. Hedge funds. Don't we hear about that a lot, hedge funds? The figure, 1.5 billion owed to these poor investors. And 25 cents on the dollar. What is Argentina thinking about paying these These poor guys that trusted in the country, bought their awful debt, and they want to now pay 25 cents on the dollar. The thing is this. A lot of people, actually the entire population in Argentina, they had no other option but to take those 25, 30 cents on the dollar back in the day. When Argentina collapsed in 2001, people had their money in the banks, right? You had $100, $100,000 or whatever in a bank, and one day they closed the doors, they kept the money, and they didn't give it back to you. Now these banks are the same big shot Wall Street bank names that you see all over the world. It's not some shady Argentine bank. It's actually the big shady banks that we all know of, the big shady corporations that you see in Wall Street. Those are the banks that were operating in Argentina, and those were the banks that kept people's money and didn't give it back. And that effectively cost the Argentine population, all of us, 70% of your savings. You had dollars that was converted into pesos, and you ended up losing 70% of your savings in that conversion of your dollars, your US dollars that you put in the bank in Argentina. The Wall Street banks decided that you weren't gonna be getting those back. So Argentina, the people of Argentina, did get screwed with this 30 cent to the dollar that these hedge funds are not willing to take, right? So it's kind of ironic that the Wall Street names that forced the entire population of a country to just accept that they were not going to be getting their money back. I mean, even for months at a time, you couldn't even get any of your money in no matter what exchange rate out of the bank. You were just allowed to get $100 a week or something like that just to stay alive, basically, and you were not allowed to get your own money. I mean, people have died because of this. This isn't a joke. People have needed surgery, operations, and they needed their own money, their own savings, so as to get those operations or surgery or treatment abroad, and needing that money to travel so as to get those treatments, those life-saving treatments, and the banks would not give them back their own money. And even when going to court and suing because of, I'm actually dying because you're not giving my money back, in some cases, actually in many cases, the court did not rule fast enough to save people's lives. So people did die because of this. People did die of heart attacks banging on those bank doors that were closed. And I'm not even talking about thousands that died because of the stress and anguish caused by all this. This 30 cent to the dollar that people had no option but to take. And now the same groups, the same Wall Street corporations are arguing that they're being robbed by the offering of 30 cents to the dollar. Let's go back to the NML Capital thing and the $1.5 billion that they are owed, or at least supposedly owed. Pretty interesting how that works. Let's see a little bit of how these companies have operated in the past. Here I have, this is all in Wikipedia actually. It says, in 1996, Elliott bought defaulted Peruvian debt for a reported 11.4 million. Peruvian debt, Peru, the country debt. Guys, Vulture funds do this. Vulture hedge funds go for junk debt, knowing that they have a place for making a claim, and they will have a ruling that benefits them quite nicely. So in 1996, Elliott bought the defaulted Peruvian debt reported at $11.4 million. In 1998, 2 years later, a U.S. court ruled that one could not buy debt with the sole purpose of suing the debtor. All right? Again, a U.S. court ruled that one could not buy debt just to sue the debtor, knowing that it wasn't going to be paying back. Elliott won a 58 million judgment in 2000 when the ruling was overturned. Okay, so Elliott buys a 1996 debt for $11.4 million. In the year 2000, 4 years later, they end up making $58 million out of the ruling that they got over that debt after overturning a ruling that said that you cannot buy debt just to screw a guy in court, right? After Argentina, it goes on, defaulted on its debt in 2002, Animal Capital, a unit of Elliott, refused to accept its offer to pay less than 30 cents on the dollar on debts that originally amounted to over 182 million, but that Elliott assessed were then worth 2.3 billion. All right, the initial offering of 30 cents to the dollar was what everyone else in Argentina got stuck with by these same corporations, these same Wall Street groups that operate in this way. Of course they wouldn't take that, what everyone else was stuck with, and didn't have a choice, but they knew that later on they could make a nice profit over that. So the originally debts amounted to over 182 million US dollars, 182 US million dollars, but that Elliott assessed were then worth 2.3 billion dollars. That's what they say themselves. All right, they say themselves, okay, you owe us 2.3 billion dollars, just like a loan shark would do with, you know, fees and whatnot. They end up building up the debt that they bought in the first place and build it up to $2.3 billion. Now, the ruling that we were talking about before says that they have to pay this NML Capital $1.5 billion. All right, so the original $182 million in 2002 now turned into $1.5 billion that they are owed. It's fascinating. It's pretty interesting the way in which they operate. Another ruling, this one I think was in, here it says, in a November 2012 piece in the Huffington Post, Argentina Foreign Affairs Minister Héctor Timerman harshly criticized Singer for attempting to collect on the debt, calling Singer the inventor of vulture funds. Timerman argued that the 127 million Singer had received from the Republic of Congo to settle a 400 million debt he had acquired for 10 million should be going to building roads, schools, and other poverty-reduced programs. The same hedge fund group that bought the Peruvian debt, that bought the Argentine debt, bought Republic of Congo debt for $10 million. They claimed that they were owed $400 million a few years later, and they ended up getting $127 million in a court ruling. All right, $10 million that they bought, and you don't even know how much they paid for those $10 million in debt in the first place. You just don't know that. But they end up turning that into a $127 million business for them. It's fascinating, and it's actually quite concerning that these things are happening throughout the world. Now, you're thinking Argentina, Congo, Peru, and you may be thinking, okay, that doesn't really affect me. Now, these corporations, these names, if you go Google all these things up and you find, if you go up the ladder, you find that it all ends up being a very small group of people. There's not that many of them. What is common is that they have tons and tons and tons of money. They make billions out of the suffering of people. Now, they do that in third world countries, buying the junk debt and doing this vulture hedge fund thing. But they do it also in more developed countries as well. All right, they did it to you as well. You're probably right now spending your days working, and a lot of what you are doing right now is gonna be in one way or another, directly or indirectly, it's gonna be ending up in the pockets of these same people that find ways of screwing over countries like Argentina, Congo, and Peru. They find ways of screwing people in other parts of the world as well, right? In US, in Europe, you end up financing these fortunes beyond reason, beyond understanding, right? And that's all financed by you. You're making this possible. At the end of the day, it's pretty much like slavery. How bad will this get in the future? We just have no idea. The only hope we have is that somehow, eventually, there's enough people that realize what's going on so as to make some change. But I'm not holding my breath. I don't think that's likely to happen. At the very least, knowing these things, understanding what's going on, understanding the different mechanisms, understanding that these funds, these corporations, and these big global players, they have ways of running business in certain countries, and they have other ways of running business in others. At the end of the day, when you realize who's financing who's putting who in office, who's financing whose campaign, you end up understanding things a little bit better, and it's quite scary. Folks, if you have someone that you believe will understand this mess of a video and you feel like sharing it, please do so. Remember to subscribe as well. Take care, have a great day. Let's hope for things getting better. See you on our next video.